It's easy sometimes to look at people of times past and question why those people may have said what they said, did what they did, believed what they believed, or even not done or said or believed what they should have. It's much easier to look back and reflect and recognize or acknowledge things that were present in our own past circumstances or situations and conclude what the best choice of action should have been. To see possibilities that during the time of occurrence were not viable to our eyes or mind. But perhaps one of the hardest or most difficult things to face is a giant in the moment. A wise person once said, "Fear is hardest to catch when it pops up like hiccups." Regardless, I can tell you for certain that all giants seem larger than they really are. This is a story about David and Goliath that can be found in the book of 1 Samuel chapter 17. Some will be paraphrased and some will be direct scriptures. In 1 Samuel 17, a giant appears. Now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle, and they were gathered at Soka, which belongs to Judah, and encamped between Soka and Ezekah and Ephes Dammim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered, and encamped in the Valley of Elah, and drew up in the line of battle against the Philistines. And the Philistines stood on the mountain on the one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, with a valley between them. And there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a helmet of bronze on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. And he had bronze armor on his legs, and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron. And his shield bearer went before him. He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." And the Philistine said, "I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together." When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. For 40 days the Philistine came forward and took his stand, morning and evening. All the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were much afraid. David, the youngest son of Jesse, was sent by his father to go to the Israelites' army and take his 3 brothers some food, as well as some of the commander of the unit. David arrives and hears Goliath's taunts. He says to Saul, "Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and will fight him." Saul told him that the battle would be lopsided, as Goliath is a man of war. Then David says something that if he doesn't mention, we would have no way of knowing about. In verses 34 through 37, it reads, "But David said to Saul, 'Your servant used to keep sheep for his father. And when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he arose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living Lord.' And David said, 'The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine.' And Saul said to David, 'Go, and the Lord be with you.'" The thing about running while in a valley is that usually one is at a low point, and one must climb mountains or take a high incline amount of slopes to escape, when sometimes the best course of action is just to face the giant then and there in that moment. Saul removed his armor and placed it on David to prepare him for combat. But David said, I cannot go in these, for I am not used to them. So he took them off. David took 5 smooth stones from the stream and placed them in the pouch of his shepherd's bag, with his sling in his hand as he approached the giant. He said to Goliath, You come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of armies of Israel, whom you have defied. And that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that the Lord saves not with sword and spear. For the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand. David slung a stone at Goliath's head, and it sank into him and killed him. He took Goliath's sword and cut off his head. The Philistines turned and ran. David took the head to Jerusalem and put the Philistines' weapon in his own tent. What else is in David's tent, perhaps? Maybe the mane from a lion, or maybe the claws from a bear. David took these things as reminders of when God had delivered him to encourage him for the next battle. There is no giant so great that God is not greater still. Following every giant victory, remember these 5 words. The battle is the Lord's.